Welcome to the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast. Conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now, here are your hosts, Ed Stetzer and Daniel Yang.
Welcome to the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of our day. My name's Daniel Yang, National Director of Churches of Welcome at World Relief, and today we're talking to Dave Ferguson. Dave's the founding and lead pastor of Chicago's Community Christian Church, the visionary for the international church planting movement New Thing, and the president of Exponential Conference. He's also an award-winning author of several books, including Bless, 5 Everyday Ways to Love Your Neighbor and Change the World, which he co-authored with his brother John. Now let's go to Ed Stetzer, editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine and the dean of the Talbot School of Theology.
It was making me smile when he was even doing that introduction, because you're a columnist for Outreach Magazine. You know, I do some stuff now with Exponential. Daniel is connected to both of us. These are a lot of friends here, a lot of good relationships. You and I are releasing together this Right Now Pastors Plus project as well. You're going to be talking about, Outwardly Focused Church, but it's right now pastorsplus.org, and you're going to be unpacking some of what we're going to talk about today. So, this is something that I've seen in person. I've told you the story when I got on the shuttle bus at the airport. I was going to get, I guess I was coming from, because I lived in Chicago at the time, and I was going to go pick up my car. You know, you take the shuttle bus over there, and I always try to make a habit. I ask the Lord in my prayer time for the privilege of sharing the gospel in person outside of a church setting once a week. So I'm always trying to start some conversations. So young couple of kids that get on the shuttle bus, and they clearly came from holidays. Oh, where'd you guys come from? Et cetera, et cetera. Started talking, and I don't remember how, but somehow, I kind of nudged the conversation along to some, the bus ride took a little time because of traffic. And I started talking to them about their, spiritual background or any religious upbringing. And they say, well, we don't really have any, but we're kind of trying to figure all that out. And then she says, yeah, I guess, we're trying to find our way to God or something. Not quite the way you say it, but enough that my spidey senses went off. And I said, well, you guys, where do you live? And they said, well, I live in Naperville. And I said, do you guys have a church? I mean, I know I have some friends there. I said, yeah, there's this place, they call it the Yellow Box. And sometimes we go and we're trying to figure all this out. And I thought to myself, only when I'm witnessing do I run into somebody that Dave Ferguson and his church have already engaged they weren't believers from what I could tell, but they're on a journey. And this is so central to what you do. You're reaching seekers long after the seeker church quit being a seeker church. So what are some of the key qualities or characteristics, do you think, of a church that has a healthy approach to outreach? And I think yours does. Tell us.
One of the key things is, I think, for church staff and church pastors to really think of themselves as culture creators. And how do you create a culture of outreach? How do you create a culture of evangelism? Which, is exactly the thing we addressed in that Pastors Plus video series. And if we got time for it, I think there's probably 3 really important components to creating a culture of outreach.
Do it.
We got time. At the core of it are values, and of course biblical values, which I think are both the passions of your heart, but also the convictions of your mind. So there's scriptural based things that you believe Matthew 28, but you also kind of feel Matthew 28. You believe, 2 Peter 3:9, but you also feel it. You want that to happen, every person to come to repentance. So I think there's the base of the values. And if you think in terms almost of like expanding concentric circles, then I think building on those values, you have to have a narrative. And when I say narrative, I think of 2 words, both language and story. There's certain language. When you have a strong culture of any kind, there's certain language that's unique to us. And you've already kind of hinted at some of ours at Community. We talk about this all the time, helping people find their way back to God. That is our mission. That's what we're all about. When people make commitments to Christ and they're baptized, and oftentimes it happens by someone in their small group that's baptized, and they'll talk about how I found my way back to God. And so,
and of course, we talked about this. I don't like that phrase. It's not my favorite.
You do. You love it.
I love the fact that when the NLT came out and translated 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17, it was closer to your phrase than. And I forget. I'll have to look up the exact number. But here's the thing. When I was at your church, I want you to finish the 3. But when I was at your church, I visited one day. I wasn't preaching. I was just there. And when I was there, I counted the number of times that somebody said, because I did enough where I asked people, and they didn't know I was, but I pretended that I was, a visitor for a while. And then I said, well, can you show me this? And And like they would say, and this is where we help kids find their way back to God. And this is where we do, I mean, I think it was 13. It was years ago, but I don't remember for sure. So it is clearly a central cultural value. So keep going. But I wanted to point out that I've seen this in action.
And what I think what you do with language too is with language, you're actually able to embed certain biblical values in it in a contemporary sense. And that's what we've really tried to do. And actually, you also embed, this kind of goes to the narrative piece, you embed stories in it. So when I say, hey, we're all about helping people find their way back to God, it sparks for everybody, oh, that was my story, or that was my neighbor's story, that was my friend's story. And so you want these values, but then you also want the narrative, which is language and story. I think storytelling is very important. So like when we baptize somebody, always we will have them write out their story and we'll read their story. And after they get baptized, I mean, it's like a giant party. People are celebrating. And oftentimes too, I mean, we'll see people, they'll give them a standing ovation after they get baptized, which I think Kim Ham was the guy who first told me, he says, you can tell what a culture values by what gets spontaneous applause. So you want those values, and then the narrative, which is language and story, but then there's the behaviors on top of it. And I think you have to have all three of those. And those behaviors are something, and I would say to lead pastors, maybe you're not a gifted evangelist by God's gifting, but there are certain behaviors, which maybe we'll have time to talk about, the blessed practices that we teach that every one of us can do. And in some ways, even by not always being successful, but by telling the stories and reinforcing the values of how you're trying to use those behaviors, you begin to create this culture of outreach, this culture of evangelism. And I think that's probably the most important thing you can do. Because again, we can go on and on this, but the culture piece, that's something that works 24/7. It works nonstop. And that's really what you want in your large or small church.
Yeah, and we see that when churches get a hold of this. And again, it may feel different than your church, a contemporary church. By the way, the verse in the NLT, 2 Corinthians 5:20 says, we speak for Christ when we plead, come back to God. So that fits your culture, kind of the context where you are. Sometimes more traditional churches might do things differently, but can still have a deeply rooted culture of evangelism. Anyway, I'm going to let Daniel ask some questions as well. We are going to get to the blessed practices because I want to tell you something about a study that we've done that I haven't told you about. I'm going to tell you right in the middle of our podcast. But Daniel, over to you.
Do I get to have a question?
No, this is not an interview show.
Why are we calling this the Stetzer podcast when Daniel is co-hosting?
It's fair. It's fair. It's
hey, Dave, I've been asking that question for about 4 years now.
Daniel, what do you want to say?
I said, I've been asking that question for about 4 years now. So.
Back when we were in the studio together, I live in California now. He lives in Chicago. You both live in Chicagoland. There used to be a thing behind us, and Daniel wanted to put a little sticker. It said Stetzer and Yang Church Leaders Podcast.
I'm working my way up. I'm working there. But Dave, I mean, I've been able to preach there at the Yellow Box. You mentioned the Yellow Box earlier. I mean,
I've never preached at the Yellow Box.
Oh,
but go ahead.
See, there we go.
To be fair, they did ask once. I couldn't come.
But even naming your main campus, the Yellow Box. Now, if people were to visit, it literally looks like a yellow box from the outside. But even that's
ugly.
Lowering the barriers for those who don't typically attend church. I mean, that's sort of embedded in the way that you all think. And so, can you talk about like the difference between like outreach as an event, as a program, versus like really trying to instill that into the people, instill that into your staff?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not opposed to outreach as an event, but I think that's probably something that larger churches might have more success at because they're able to have the kind of staff and have the kind of things that can pull off events. But I think as a process or as a relationship, what was the word you used? Event versus.
Yeah, I mean, what the difference between like your staff and your people like embodying the culture of outreach versus just kind of a one-time event?
Yeah, I think seeing it as an event or I see it as a relationship or as a process. I think that's something that everybody can engage in. And I think in some ways when you begin to make that shift and go, okay, it's not just something we do on Sundays. It's not just something we do, in the fall and in the first of the year. It's not just something we do for a week out of the year, but it is something we can do every day. I think you're able to actually equip your people. And so for us, I mean, particularly with the blessed practices, but I'd also, we can talk about Alpha too, because I'm a big Alpha fan. I think both of those things are not so much event oriented as they are really kind of more relationship and more process oriented, which I think is you're able to engage the whole church and equip the whole church to be involved in outreach and evangelism, where events is maybe it's only highlighting a few gifts and you're kind of almost like you're bringing everybody else to expose them to that.
Yeah, it seems that it's fair to say that you work hard to set a broad table for people to be engaged in outreach. So Alpha is going to be led by lay leaders by and large. Your blessed practices. Now, here's the thing. We're doing this research project that we haven't released yet. And we might release it, we might not release it, because it's one of those projects where we're informing something and we're going to write about it. So it might be a while. But I will tell you, the researcher said to me recently, so do you know how many people have sort of mentioned the blessed practices? We're actually surveying high impact churches who are reaching curious and spiritually open people. And one of the common things we hear them talking about is the blessed practices. So I think it's, and I know you have an app too, but tell us, I mean, it's an acronym. So go through the acronym. So, sure. And I want to set it up for you. So culturally, again, when I came to visit the Community Christian Church, it wasn't just I heard it from Dave up front. I think John was preaching that week, and I did hear it from them. But I heard it from like the parking lot. I heard it from the people who showed me around the childcare. I heard it from the people. All those people were saying we're helping people find their way back to God. They got the common mission, and it was in the water. But then I'm of the view that you need to give people some handholds, something they can do. If you ever carried a box when we were kids, boxes didn't have handholds in them. And then somebody like 5 years ago said, let's put handholds in boxes. It was like the biggest scientific breakthrough in history. Well, I think that things like the blessed practices or things like Alpha or things like events give people handholds so they can hold on to this thing called evangelism and do it. So go through and explain the acronym of the blessed practices. And as he does, just keep in mind that this is something that we've seen a significantly impactful role in churches that are reaching curiously open skeptics and seekers.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, in short, as I introduce the blessed practices, we talk about these as 5 everyday ways you can love your neighbor. And keep in mind, too, that we're kind of saying, you know what, it's God's job to judge people. It's the Holy Spirit's job to convict people. It's your job to love your neighbor. And so how do we actually do that? Because I actually think people show up at our churches going like, I want to do this. I do want to follow Jesus. I do want to love. Now just tell me how. Give me some practical hows. And I think what these 5 practices do really are kind of like, yeah, here's how you can actually do it. So we put it away, like you said, so there's handles so you can actually grab a hold of this and do it every day. The B stands for begin with prayer. And so in your neighborhood, like I did this morning, I have 8 different folks in my neighborhood that I pray for specifically by name. So you begin by prayer. That's how the mission begins. Then the L stands for listen. And I think these intentionally they also kind of build on each other in kind of a process. We're in a season where you have to wait in line to get to a counselor. And I think people are longing just to be listened to. And in fact, one of the most loving acts I think you can do for someone is to listen to them. And quite frankly, I think Christians are often more known for our talking than our listening. And I think if we would lead by listening and letting other people tell their story, that's huge, huge, huge win. So that begin with prayer. L stands for listen. The E stands for eat. My experience is that if you want to move an acquaintance to a friendship, have a shared meal, even a cup of coffee, even a dessert. That's what moves an acquaintance to a friendship. And again, you see all these in the life of Jesus too. First thing he did when he started his ministry, he began with prayer. He listens a lot more than he asks a lot more questions than he does anything else. E, you see him eating with like Zacchaeus and other people when he really wants to get to know folks. The first S then of the 5 practices then is serve. Because when you begin with prayer, you listen and eat with someone, they will tell you how to love them. I think I can say this. One of the 8 people on my list is my neighbor across the street, Bill. Bill's a great guy, funny guy. I enjoy Bill immensely. Unfortunately, in the last year, Bill found out he had cancer.
The Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast is part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network, which is dedicated to resourcing church leaders in order to help them face the complexities of ministry today. The Church Leaders Podcast Network supports pastors and ministry leaders by challenging assumptions, by providing insights, and offering practical advice and solutions and steps that will help church leaders navigate the variety of cultures and contexts that we're serving in. Learn more at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network.
And so, I've been texting with him back and forth. I told him I was praying for him. And of course, he's He's delighted to have someone pray for him. Just this morning, he texted me back and said, "Hey, I got the scans back. I'm cancer free." And it was, and I got to say, "Hey, I'm so excited. Congrats." And I'm also thanking God for answered prayer. And he's like, "Yes, brother." But one of the ways I got to serve him, as small as it might feel in some ways, I mean, when you're going through cancer, I was able to pray for him consistently. And that I do think that meant a lot to him. Then the last S is story. And so once you get to those things and you've loved somebody, you've eaten with them, you listened to them, you prayed for them, then you get a chance to share your story of how Jesus has changed your life. And again, proclamation is important, but we would say maybe it doesn't have to be first. Maybe it doesn't have to be first. And what I've found is these are 5 everyday ways that anybody can love their neighbor. And one of the things I like about it too is you're not having to add something else to your schedule. It's like how you live your life. It's how you do life. So there they are pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's good. It's a little disappointing that the first letter B isn't something that really
I know, that's such a bummer. So close. It's such a
is
kind
there
of
some
begin
Latin
with
word
prayer.
for prayer or something? I don't even know. But it's begin with prayer, listen, eat, serve, story. And,
Exactly.
And again, I want people to hear that I think that this is having a lot of impact on a lot of churches. Okay, so I want to come back to the beginning of the culture thing. I think some people are saying right now, well, Dave, you're just kind of a naturally, outwardly focused guy. You're just kind of think that way. And again, I think there's some fairness to that. I mean, that's one of the reasons we asked you to talk about 7 traits of an outwardly looking church in the Right Now Pastors Plus. And so what my question for you is, you've helped hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of churches to be more outwardly looking, and they don't have to be like you in personality. So the vast majority of our audience are pastors and church leaders. How do they start? And I would just start at the very beginning. How do they start raising up that culture? So then they can say, do the blessed practices. Let's start a, Christian Explorer group or an Alpha group, but if you don't have the culture there, it doesn't get there. So how do we get the culture there?
I won't give all because we go through 7 steps in the Pastors Plus, and I put it in those steps so we can understand it, and we can actually live them out. But one of the key things early on, and again, whether you're a gifted evangelist or not, is for you just to do it yourself.
Right.
And again, if you think
what you won't live is what the old preacher would say.
There you go. Thank you. And again, think about these 5 practices. I mean, those are things any of us can do. As believers, as followers, any of us can do that. And so you have to do it. And then I would encourage you also, then second after that, is to get your key leaders, maybe your staff. What I would say is maybe the top 15, 16, 17% of your people, get them doing it. And once you get them doing it, then you're ready to teach it. That's kind of the third thing I'd say. Then you teach it. And after you teach it, then you have to figure out ways, how do we reinforce this? And we talk about that in the Pastors Plus over and over and over again. But not surprising, seeing yourself as a culture creator, whether you're naturally gifted or not, that you value it enough and that you're talking about it enough and you're trying to do it enough, it'll take root in your church. And I think you'll see your church become a much more outreach-oriented church.
Dave, I've got a community story too. My wife and I, we were at an Italian restaurant there in Naperville where your main campus is at, and our server was wearing a Bless bracelet. And I think I texted you and John that you all were doing a great job, mobilizing your members. At least it was top of mind, and they would, and he was a fantastic server, and we tipped him well, just to let you know. But that was a bracelet. It's a constant reminder. What led to the creation of the app? What is the app? How does it help, and how did it come about?
Well, the truth is the creation of the app wasn't even our idea. It's our friends at Glue. They had the Bless Every Home app, which has been around for a while, but I think they weren't satisfied with some of the practices that were a part of that. And so then they came to John and I and said, hey, could we can use those practices in this, and let's start calling it the Bless app. And so it's been less than a year now, we actually made that shift. So if you go to, I think it's theblessapp.com.
It is theblessapp.com. Yep.
Okay. If you do that, I mean, you can take a look at it there. And one of the things that's kind of cool about it is, like, I was on it this morning because that's part of my routine. They will show you, here's your 40 neighbors, where they live and their names. And then when you select which ones, then you can actually begin to do any of those 5 practices, and it allows you to actually have a personal kind of scorecard of sorts, where I know exactly, like I mentioned Bill, I know how many times I've prayed for Bill. I know how many times I listened for Bill. I also know there's a little place in there too where I said, because this week I happened to see him out by the mailbox, went over, how you doing? He said, well, I'm getting the scans back. So I said, hey, do you care if I pray for you right now? And he's like, sure. And so then I just put a little note, because there's a place for notes in the app too, like, hey, prayed for Bill, asking God for a clean scan. So it's at an individual level, it's free. It's just a great piece of technology that I think accelerates your using those 5 practices.
Yes, I have my little slip of paper in the back of my Bible. So this is like, takes it to the next level, the kind of thing. When I preach and teach, I would say, make a map of your neighborhood, map where your neighbors are, make a list of people who are not in your neighborhood. And then in doing so, you can kind of, walk that journey with those people. So I love that. And I think that's so helpful. Okay. So a lot of our audience are smaller churches. Most churches are smaller churches. So what does it look like? Starting in Alpha might be that might even be a big thing. So what are some things? I guess Bless App could be something you can do immediately. But what are some things you would suggest for smaller and mid-sized churches to do?
I mean, you kind of said, if I had 5 minutes to sit down with the pastor, and he's like, hey, give me 2 takeaways that can make a big difference. I would say, number 1, I'd say start doing the Bless practices, and then start teaching them, and using the Bless app as a great tool for your church. And I can explain how that is a tool for the church if you want. But then secondly, I would tell them, and do Alpha. Because it's funny, I mean, a lot of the same practices that we have within Bless, prayer, listen, eat, serve, I mean, are the same things that make Alpha really work. Because you're showing up with this community of folks who said, no, you can ask any questions you want. There's a shared meal. So I think those 2 people,
if Alpha is not your thing, community Christians, so central to Alpha. If Alpha is not your thing, we're not mad at you. There's Christian Explored. There's all kinds of resources like that. The point is, it's something that your people in your church can do, that you have a conversation, you follow some of those blessed practices as well. Those all sort of line up accordingly to just take in an opportunity. Okay. So when you think about ways churches do outreach, because again, we're trying to, I think because evangelism's fallen on hard times. And I think in part it's fallen on hard times because the ways that we do evangelism have shifted, the way people in the culture receive evangelism. And so now when I hear people talk about evangelism, I most commonly hear them joke about how we used to do it. Well, we used to do so-and-so. Well, first of all, I'm for all the ways we can do evangelism. But I'm also for celebrating ways that are actually having some impact, like what we're talking about with Bless or other things like that. So what are some misconceptions that you think that you see church leaders sort of ending up going down that dead end? Maybe they have to their approach on outreach. What are those misconceptions that those pastors have that you can help persuade them in our short conversation today? What do you think?
I think well-meaning church leaders, we teach on it, and then we wonder why nothing changes.
Okay.
And if I could go back to the values, narrative, behavior, when we just teach on it and we're not actually doing it ourselves, or even just attempting, like the blessed practices, what we're actually implicitly doing is we're going, oh, I only have to sit here and listen to this person talk about it because I know this person doesn't even do it. And so if we do both those things, yes, hold the values, but also, yes, keep teaching. You're doing a great job. Keep teaching. But just start doing these. And you don't have to be awesome at it. You just have to be trying like the rest of us. Then you can create the culture. So I think the misconception, if I just teach on it, that's going to change. My experience is that's not enough. There takes a certain level of leadership and going like, hey, I'm in this with you. I'm in this struggle with you. And, I'm going to do my best to use these 5 everyday ways to love my neighbor. So I think that's a misconception. I think on the church side, I think a lot of folks are motivated. They do want to love their neighbor, but they don't have the answer to how. And that's, again, being redundant. That's why I love these 5 practices. It's like, here is how you can love your neighbor. And there are some folks that kind of think, that's the pastor's job. And we have to debunk that myth. It's not the pastor's job.
Dave, I mean, inevitably, Sunday gatherings are still a very great opportunity for people to hear the gospel. I would say, by and large, most evangelistic pastors see Sunday morning as one of the big opportunities. So as your teaching team, as you're crafting messages, you're thinking about language, you're thinking about how the non-believer might listen. What are some of the things that you're processing as a teacher and as a teaching team when you're crafting those messages?
You are looking to be careful about the kind of language that you use. Because there's a lot of insider language, and to be honest, I feel like the longer I'm a pastor, the more susceptible I am to that. And if you can bring new people to the table, even new believers to the table, I just came from a teaching team meeting with Chris and Tammy this morning, and there was one of the stories that Chris told. I mean, I think Tammy kind of called out and said, "Hey, I'm not sure that people are going to really they're going to understand what you're talking about there." And she's seeing it through the grid of like, okay, people who are showing up for the very first time, along with maybe a friend. So you definitely have to do that. And I think, again, if you can give people a simple steps for how to find their way, is our language, to find their way back to God, I think that's also very helpful. Because at this point, people aren't showing up at church just because they got nothing to do on Sunday morning. There's probably a search going on. And if you can give them clear next steps, that's a huge help to them as well.
Yeah. So what would be, when you kind of draw people and you say to them, let's begin this journey, what would be some of those next steps? Do you, ultimately you want them to trust Christ and receive Him as Lord and Savior and be baptized? But what more than that to lead up to that?
For us, a lot of times, we almost always encourage people, the next step is to join a small group. And I know it seems like a big step, but we have a high percentage of our people in small groups. And for us, once they get into a group, that's the place where almost always people find their way back to God in the context of that small group. Because like when someone gets baptized, and that'll often happen in one of our worship services, it's usually somebody from their small group, or like Alpha, and I would consider that also a different form of small group. That has led them to faith, and we will say, "Hey, who would you like to have baptize you?" And they'll pick someone from their group. So for us, that is the primary next step.
Dave, this has been a helpful conversation, and you mentor a lot of church planters and pastors. As we get ready to wrap up here, if you're talking to a new church planter, somebody who's starting a new church, or maybe somebody who's a young leader that's stepping into leading a church, how can you encourage them towards the future, especially around keeping outreach and evangelism at the forefront? How would you encourage them?
I feel like I'm saying the same things over and over again, Daniel.
I think that's sort of keep in mind when I came visit your church that you said the same thing over and again 13 times. So that's not
maybe I only know a couple of things, so maybe that's why.
But I do think the redundancy and the repetition is actually helpful because Dave, I'm just of the view that we're seeing, because people have lost confidence in their evangelism methods, they therefore have said, I'm not going to do evangelism. And what I would say is there are other ways, relational ways, connected ways. And again, let me be clear. I think you would agree with me. I'm for everybody doing evangelism in all different kinds of ways. When I see
Absolutely,
that person 100%. In the London corner preaching, I'm that person. If they're preaching the gospel, they're on my team. So I don't I'm with you. But part of why we had you on is that we see a significant number of people coming to faith in Christ. We see the practices you putting forth impacting other churches. So you're kind of, for us, an example of a church that has a high outreach, capacity and activity. And again, that's even why, Right Now Media asked you to do the Pastors Plus thing. And we'll put that too, by the way. It's right now, pastorsplus.org, and people can get there, and then the course will come out. A lot of people already have Right Now Media, so they'll be familiar with it. So I guess I don't need you to feel like there's some brilliant insight that we're kind of expecting you to have. I just tell us how you would encourage pastors and church leaders to do what you are already doing naturally, but maybe it's not natural for them. And it can be redundant, it can be repetitive, but just make it brilliant and insightful.
Okay, there we go. So here's what I would tell them. I would say, pick 8 of your neighbors. And when I say neighbors, it could be somebody where you live. It could be also somebody where you play. If I wasn't talking to a pastor, I'd say it's somewhere where you work, but I'd say pick 8 of them. And what I want you to do is I want you to begin praying for them every day. You start praying for them every day. And for years, they would be 8 names I'd write down in my journal, like more recently in the last year. Now it's those 8 names in my app. And then as God gives you opportunity, and here's what happens. You'll grow a sensitivity towards those people. Like when my neighbors come out, it's like after you've been praying for them, especially in Chicago, like if you've been it's kind of one of those, you've been praying for them all winter and you haven't seen them all winter, and all of a sudden the spring you see it. I have to kind of try not to attack them. But you do, then you're going like, oh, this is my chance to have a conversation, to listen to them, and I would say, yeah, and figure out ways, how can you actually be hospitable? And it might be a trip to Starbucks, or it might be a cookout in the backyard to eat together, and then serve them as you discover what's going on in their life. And then eventually just ask God for an opportunity to share your story. I would also say, and as you talk about it, and again, I think, Ed, you've kind of onto something. I think evangelism has kind of become a bad word, and it shouldn't be. It absolutely shouldn't be a bad word. But I have emphasized more and more, this is how you love your neighbor. You guys just keep loving your neighbor in these 5 ways. And what we find is they'll find their way back to God. So I would encourage a young pastor, particularly a young church planter, begin with you. And as you start doing it, then we're going to figure out how do we actually spread and equip other people to do the same.
Yes, and they will then, because of your Arminian heritage, God's working prevenient in their heart, giving them the work, the nudge, the draw to Him, so that then, because of prevenient grace, they can enter into a real. I'm just theologizing some of what you said, but
No, this is why we love you, Ed. This is your niche.
Appreciate you, brother.
Wait,
Daniel?
Explain like a good Calvinist. We've been talking to Dave Ferguson. Be sure to check out the Bless app at theblessapp.com and his new course coming out at rightnowpastorsplus.org. You can learn more about Dave at daveferguson.org. Thanks again for listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. You can find more interviews as well as other great content from ministry leaders at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast. And again, if you found a conversation today helpful, love for you to take a few moments to leave us a review. That'll help other ministry leaders find us and benefit from our content. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.
You've been listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. For more great interviews, as well as articles, videos, and free resources, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.